Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics. In this video, I like to read between the lines of the new COVID rules as announced by Boris Johnson, as well as how this very different way of making the announcement shows signs that his own MPs seem to be bringing him to heel. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So what I really want to go through here are the new restrictions. Of course, as they were announced in the House of Commons by Boris Johnson, they would apply to England because Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland can sort of do their own thing. But there was talk of Boris Johnson actually meeting with the other parliaments and assemblies in the UK to discuss this. Not sure whether that has been done fruitfully or not. We will see. But what I'm going to go through the new restrictions really quickly because there's 6 main categories. But what I want to focus on is Boris Johnson's changed approach and what that means, but also how his announcement is an indirect admission that he has no idea what he's doing with COVID now. He's completely abandoned any hopes of dealing with it. So first of all, what he said, he's gone through 6 things. The first one is he said, after saying to office workers, telling them that they're traitors a little bit ago, for working at home when they should be going back to the office and buying sandwiches. Now what they're saying is, and word for word, we are once again asking office workers who can work from home to do so. In key public services and in all professions where home working is not possible, such as construction or retail, people should continue to attend their workplaces. But if you can work from home, the government's now saying should work from home. Second one, it says from Thursday, all pubs, bars and restaurants must operate a table service only, except for takeaways. Together with all hospitality venues, they must close at 10 p.m. That was announced ahead of time. Shouldn't have been, but it was. So we sort of knew about that one anyway. And it says to help police enforce this rule, that means closing, not just calling for last orders. You actually close at 10. Then it says third, extend the requirement to wear face coverings to include staff in retail, all users of taxis and private hire vehicles, and staff and customers in indoor hospitality, except when seated at a table to eat or drink. Again, should have happened from the start. The idea that people going into a store or, would have to wear masks was one thing. Not quite a lot of places that I went into, the staff were wearing visors or masks at least, or both anyway, but also quite a lot were not. So I say a lot as if I've gone into a lot. I've gone into supermarkets, that's it. But there was a bit of disparity in terms of the staff is what I mean, not the places. Not been to that many places. But now it's just going to be, do you know what? I mean, there's a higher risk amongst the staff. Staff more so should wear them. But anyway, so that's now going to be the case. It says, fourth, in retail, leisure and tourism and other sectors, so I'll need to see the regulation, see what he means by that, our COVID secure guidelines will become legal obligations. So in other words, what is guidance at the moment will now become the law. Fifth, now is the time to tighten up the rule of 6. I'm afraid that from Monday, he said, a maximum of 15 people will be able to attend wedding ceremonies and receptions. Though up to 30 can still attend a funeral. Now we're discussing this with my girlfriend and, we're saying, well, I can understand why they're saying Monday and not putting that in place straight away, because obviously there will be wedding receptions happening this week and people may have already travelled to them. Now, sure enough, there'll be ones going on Monday for which people may have bought dresses, done stuff, booked hotels, all the rest of it, taken time off work, but they won't have travelled there yet. But I am going to say to anyone who's already outlaid a lot of cash to go, and now they're not going to be able to next Monday, I'm afraid to say I judge harshly anyone who seriously thought that it was a good idea to go at a time like this anyway. So I'm afraid I'm not going to have too much sympathy for that. But there you go. And then finally, he says he's going to extend the rule of 6 to all adult indoor team sports. Interestingly, where I'm not sure about this, because at first when he said this, I just thought, oh, that'll mean all places that do sporting activities indoors. And I thought, oh, just indoor team sports. So what about like snooker clubs or something? How's that going to, is that just going to, they still going to be allowed? Obviously spaced out. Snooker halls tend to be spaced out anyway. So I'm not sure about that one. But anyway, really the main takeaways from this one, in terms of how Johnson's announcement is a frank admission of failure, because you may be going, so what's this all about? He announced 6 categories of new COVID restrictions. in the House of Commons yesterday. He said, and this was absolutely the key line for me, we should expect these restrictions to remain in place for 6 months. Now, in response to questions that he took in the House after his statement, he acknowledged that if the situation got worse, then the restrictions would have to be tightened. And he also acknowledged that that the restrictions could be eased if the situation got better. So, the first reading between the lines here, if the restrictions will be tightened if the situation gets worse, and the restrictions will be loosened if the situation gets better. Saying that we should expect these restrictions to remain in place for 6 months means that he does not expect the situation to get better for 6 months. Now, I want you to consider the full implications of that. First of all, the reason we are in this mess and needing tighter restrictions now is because our test and trace system cannot cope. Boris Johnson is basically saying he does not expect our test and trace to improve to the point where it can cope for 6 months. This, of course, means that he does not expect it to improve at all. Because then you think about, so where's the 6 months come from? Have they just mathematically modelled that with our current test and trace it'll take 6 months to get it under control? No, of course not. What are the next 6 months? Autumn and winter. We've just entered autumn. 3 months of that, 3 months of winter. So we have just dealt with COVID in spring and summer, or more accurately, failed to cope. If we cannot cope well during spring and summer, we're completely knackered in autumn and winter, which the Prime Minister said himself were times when the infections would be much more difficult to control. That's the reason for the 6 months, not because he thinks any measure he's putting in place is going to deal with the issue. He's just hoping that winter turning into spring will deal with the issue naturally, at least suppress it to the point where our testing system can cope. Think about that. Think about that for this government's level of ambition. The second implication here is it means we're going to be having these restrictions in place as we enter Boris Johnson-inspired hard Brexit. COVID has already hampered what few piss-poor attempts at preparing we were actively pursuing, and we are nowhere near ready. And those preparations can now only get slower and less effective. So the first thing to take home is that the government have no plan whatsoever for dealing with COVID. None at all. They are hoping that the coming of the season of spring will give them the respite to ease restrictions, because their measures certainly will not do it. These measures announced can only attempt to keep a lid on things, and not a very tight lid at that. Then there was the way he announced these measures. So over the past 6 months, Boris Johnson and other ministers have announced a lot of COVID measures, quite a lot of them. Yesterday was different, not because they U-turned again. I mean, a few weeks ago, like I said, they were branding as traitors anyone who tried to work from home instead of going into the office. Yesterday, the government were telling people to work at home if they can for the good of the country. It's so confusing knowing what to do as a traitor these days. I really can't keep up. Now, that wasn't the difference in approach. The difference in approach was that Johnson announced the measures in the House of Commons. Previously, and much to the annoyance of the House of Commons, including his own MPs, his government kept making announcements either on television to the nation, so the first MPs would hear about it was watching him on the box, or he would announce it to journalists just on the street. Sometimes you'd have ministers just doing, an interview on the street outside of Parliament just to rub salt into the wound and not announce it to Parliament first. This time it was different. Well, it was a little different, actually. Michael Gove was doing a round of interviews yesterday morning saying how important it was that, they announced policies to Parliament first. This is very important. Yes, we haven't been doing it for 6 months. It's terribly important we do so. But that didn't stop him announcing some of the policies to those journalists before Johnson was even allowed to get into Parliament, let alone stand up and talk to MPs first. But it was still a major change and a sign that Conservative MPs have finally lost their patience, because there's no way opposition parties force Boris Johnson to do that. They don't have the numbers. And although these measures come into force, over the next few days, the last one, as I say, coming into force next Monday, the Prime Minister did promise MPs a debate on all the measures next week. Now, what he did not say was whether they would be allowed a vote on them, potentially amending them. That being said, Parliament doesn't need the Prime Minister's permission to do that, because if a majority of them want a vote, then a majority of them may have a vote. They can insist on it, because that's how parliamentary sovereignty works. It's not for the government to allow Parliament to do anything. It is for Parliament to allow the government to do things, which is why whenever the government drop the ball, Parliament have the power to compel the government to behave differently. That they do not do so is on them. Now, as for the reason for this change, it's because, as I talked about recently, the emergency powers that Boris Johnson forced through in March are up for review very soon. Next week, I think. Now, this was obviously an olive branch, an attempt to be more reasonable, to show that he can behave himself, that he's heard these backbench MPs' concerns, in the hopes that they will rubber stamp another 6 months of these emergency powers. Because after all, most of his MPs aren't that bothered about the other terrible things he's doing with these powers. They're just annoyed that he's not consulting them over COVID measures. But that is my take on it anyway. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.